Nights. I am Vanessa White Rogers, and I'm the host of Fabric of Folklore. This is a podcast where we explore all the glorious quirks and weirdness of folklore, but we also really get into the nitty-gritty and try and understand the importance and significance behind the folklore. So we ask the questions that you always wanted to know when you read a folktale. Why? Why is that there? Why are these stories and traditions important? And what does it mean to the people that they come from? So today we have a really great guest. His name is Dan. He's an educator, an artist, a media creator, and a podcaster. His most recent endeavor in the podcasting world is called Selkie Cast, which explores Selkie folklore, especially, but also the culture, storytelling, and the intersection of all those things together. He's been researching and collecting material ever since first reading a short story in the early 2000s about a Selkie boy set in a modern day, which has culminated in Selkie Cast podcast, where he is cataloging his research, making connections, and exploring Selkie lore and other related areas more in depth. So thank you, Dan, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored and humbled because I've been catching up on your show, and the folks you've had on so far are quite treasures of information and research and qualifications and experience and personality. I feel like I'm more still, even with all the time that's passed since I've gotten into this realm of folklore. Discovery, I still feel like I'm kind of at the beginning of my journey, especially when it comes to the research and the academia part. I actually looked into getting a doctorate around related stuff, using this as a starting point. I just need to find the means to make that happen. But I
like a doctorate in like a folklorist degree, possibly.
The degree is a collaborative intersection. It's called media. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and so I'm near Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, known locally, and they have a great program called Media, Art, and Text. I believe it's called Media, Art, and Text.
Yeah.
So it is kind of like it's a cross-curricular look at art through media, the evolution of it.
Right.
And, there's some kind of like textual output. So I was hoping that would be, my dissertation would be simultaneously like a research paper about the non-fiction part of it, as you would say, but also a novel or something, graphic novel. I'm a filmmaker by trade and background, so that would be nice, but that's a really big undertaking that it may not be reasonable. But so I just feel like I'm kind of I hope I can stack up against your other guests.
I'm sure you will
to some degree, because I'm not as professionally renowned or experienced as they are, but definitely as passionate, I'd like to hope.
Yeah, well, and I don't think, I'm sure there are some people who know about Selkies, but it's just not as well known in the outer community. So I'm excited to have you on to talk about this, because it is actually one of my favorite folklore stories as well. I was introduced to it through the movie Song of the Sea. I think you mentioned that in one of your podcasts, and that was my first introduction to it. And I actually...
Such a wonderful film.
It's so beautiful. It's just absolutely beautiful. And that song, I think it's the same title, Song of the Sea. I sing that to my kids all the time. It's just so hauntingly.
Such a wonderful lullaby. Yeah.
It's gorgeous. So let's get into your background and your journey into what made you even want to start Selkie Cast. So you can walk us through like your whole journey in media and art.
Okay. Should I go back to the beginning? Sure. I mean, can you give an overview? Like I said, I'm a teacher and a writer, so I can't be verbose. Feel free to help me truncate my thoughts. But essentially, some of my earliest of course, growing up uh, as a child descendant of, my ancestry is Scotch Irish. There's some German in there.
Mhm.
And my mom grew up in the Midwest, and she was also, exposed to a lot of Native American lore.
Mhm.
So there was just we had a lot of Kachina dolls around the house and things. We go visit her mom in Phoenix and explore that kind of stuff too. But so I remember, folklore and just stories beyond pop culture were definitely a part. I was also, really into comic books and
Mm.
superheroes, and
Mhm.
it's been interesting to look at that through that lens too as I've gotten older, and the more like kind of analytical and academic view. What that film with Bruce Willis and uh, I'm blanking on the name
Robin
off the
Hood?
top of my head. No, the
Oh,
this
that's
M
Kevin
Night
Costner.
Shyamalan movie.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I love that Robin Hood film too. But the Unbreakable,
Oh, okay.
Unbreakable with Samuel L. Jackson, and the thesis is that us collecting superheroes in comic books is just an ancient form of modernizing, like the people that we would look up to, the people that
Mhm.
we want to look up to, the people
Yeah.
that we want to believe in, our heroes,
Mhm.
and also our villains. I just, that kind of thing has been, especially because that genre has been so popular and permeating the mainstream in the
Mhm.
past couple decades, especially. It's been fun to look at that too. So, I grew up with all that kind of stuff in my realm of exposure. But I also remember my parents used to play audiobook tapes. My parents are classical musicians, and so they
Oh,
would
wow.
they would play either like classical music or the movie soundtracks, because that was, like modernized classical music, or fairy tale books. I remember we had a Hans Christian
Mhm.
Andersen
Yeah.
tape, cassette tape that and it would help get us to sleep. And I remember some of like the Little Mermaid and Hansel and Gretel and things like that. Some of the early stories. I still remember, kind of drifting off to sleep and then having some really gnarly dreams about, in the world and the tone of those characters. And ever since I was a little kid, I just really enjoyed, uh, you know, playing with toys, but not just kind of bashing them together. But I would have these very intricate stories, and
You're always a
you know,
storyteller.
um, yeah, I love to have these ongoing multi-day or week scenarios playing out and see where it would go. And I tried to write novels and things when I was a kid, without understanding, really like the structure, the
Yeah.
essence of story. Just wanted to emulate the things that I enjoyed. But and then in high school, I had intention of being a writer. Going off to college, I just didn't know what exactly I wanted to write. And then by the time I was in college and I was exposed to film, I was always interested in film, but yeah, as a actual professional degree and avenue for employment, and I got really interested in that. And then I went to University of the Arts in Philadelphia to study
Mhm.
screenwriting and modern and narrative video production. And during that time, that's, as you mentioned earlier, I had a creative writing friend at a school in Maryland, and he sent me that story. It was called Finboy, and it was just a paper that he wrote for his creative writing class, maybe sophomore and junior year. And there was something about it that just really caught my attention because it was about, it was a supernatural undertone, but it was really this family drama about
Mhm.
a overly obsessive and neurotic mother that was terrified of her son being exposed to any larger amounts of water because that
Mhm.
would bring them back to their intuitive, dormant selkiness. And they had, in that particular iteration, you had uh, webbing, between the fingers and
Mhm.
toes and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, there was something about it just really grabbed me. And I got to give credit to my friend his name is Chris Herman. He's a excellent writer. And his work I have linked on my website.
Yeah, we can definitely link that.
But thank you. Yeah. And then, I was so inspired by that branch of folk, because I also had never heard about.
Mhm.
Maybe I had, but I didn't realize it. But
Mhm.
I was so familiar and kind of over a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of mermaidness that's out there.
Mhm.
I love the Little Mermaid and stories like that, but I never heard of shape shifting
Mhm.
seals, and it just sparked some kind of fascination. And so that my senior film was a short film about Selkies, and I tried to pitch it for my senior screenplay, but my panel didn't go for it. They had me do like an action movie, but so it's been there. The intention has been there for a long time. Just
Mhm.
was just interested at first on more just taking what was already there, just like my friend Chris did, and kind of update and modernize. Taking something from
Mhm.
a past oral tradition and putting it into a modern setting and just see how it would play out. My work was just more of an adaptation of what he was doing. And then the years went on, and in 2008, I went to Ireland, and some of the books I have behind me, I just
Cool.
started. We were in Ireland, and I had already started finding some things. I used to work at the Maryland Renaissance Fair, and
Oh,
they had a
I've
really
been
cool.
there.
Oh yeah. Well, where are you
I'm in Texas.
geographically?
I'm in
Oh,
Texas.
okay.
Mhm.
Which also has a big Renaissance fair
We do.
somewhere.
Yes, it's outside
Yeah.
of
But you've
Houston.
been to the Maryland one?
Yeah, yeah, we go to
Yeah.
the Houston one a lot. It's like it's the biggest. The one in Houston is the biggest in the U.S., I believe.
Hmm.
But the Maryland one is very
Some of
nice.
the vendors that I used to work for, I know that they travel. They go to. There's a big one in Phoenix. There's one in Pennsylvania, and they go to the one in Texas.
Hmm.
But yeah, I was still a big fan of the Renaissance Fair circuit. But they had a great, like kind of Celtic Renaissancey
Oh,
bookstore,
cool.
and
Yeah.
I found some stuff there, and I was just flipping through things, and I saw the Selkies, and I was like, this is really interesting because this what they're describing here doesn't quite line up with what I had originally
Mm.
looked into.
Hmm.
Because Chris, my friend that wrote the story, kind of pointed me to where he got his ideas from, which was he was doing some research from the Orkney Island Heritage Foundation
Okay.
and learned about them from there. Yeah, so that I was looking at it through that lens. But then I started to notice that there were different iterations of the story, and just like there are with every kind of
Hmm.
folklore. Your first guest on your first episode spoke to that so well,
Lisa Lunga
and that and
Larson.
hmm
Hmm.
there was so much that she touched on that was just exact. I was like, yes, like that's I find that also incredibly fascinating about
Hmm.
the different cultures that um, how did they learn about this? Was it just a parallel kind of thing, or was it it kind of come from somewhere else, and then they had their own cultural take on it that you know changed it over time? And so the stories that we hear now are this interesting conglomeration of a
Hmm.
lot of different influences and factors. They're not the original story, which is what I kind of took it as, or what I often hear people, when they refer to Selkie stories, like the story that was told. And I actually I hadn't heard of that author before, and I just bought her book this morning, so I'm really curious to see because that's kind of want to kind of turn the next page for me was, oh, I'd like to see what other iterations there are out there of this
Hmm.
thing. And I started getting interested in just collecting. I didn't have any goal in mind at the time. I was just, if I came across a story, a book, or in a film, I just kind of would get it,
Collect it.
collect it. It was my collecting thing for a while. Like I said, then I went to Ireland in 2008 with my parents, and I started popping in bookstores and asking some local you know people at the stores and markets and things about what they know, and I was pointed towards a couple other really wonderful books. There's this book by actually, if I grab it, I'm going to knock over the other ones, but David Thompson wrote this incredible recounting of oral history, uh, very similar to what like a lot of anthropologists do, where they just go around and talk to they travel to the areas where these myths and legends and folklore are from, and they
Uh-huh.
they document the oral tradition. Yeah, and it's fascinating how much in these collection of stories from the book by David Thompson, The People of the Sea. This is what my last episode of the Selkie Cast was about. Was kind of comparing two anthologies of that were like direct transcripts of oral tradition
Mm-hmm.
around the Selkie stories. One was specific to Scotland. That one's called The Tales of the Seal People
Mm-hmm.
by Duncan Williamson, and the other one, The People of the Sea by David Thompson, is a little bit broader. Sorry, Duncan Williamson's is specifically Scotland,
Mm-hmm.
and the ones by David Thompson are taken from a vast like geographical and also cultural scope, and over a long period of time.
So he
But
moves. He's not just in Ireland and Scotland. He's elsewhere as well. Where else does he go?
Yeah, he travels everywhere, like the Faroe Islands to the Orkneys, Shetlands, the coasts of Ireland, Scotland,
Mm-hmm.
Norway, Iceland is mentioned. There's a very wide, and again, like your guest spoke to this when she was talking about trolls. Thought was just the parallels, the thing, because I don't know that as much about trolls.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've gleaned so far about Selkies is it's a great window into folklore in general of understanding this cultural evolution, this era evolution where it changes and evolves and keeps getting passed down and
Mm-hmm.
passed along, but that game of telephone
Mm-hmm.
is played, where it doesn't end up the way that it started. So I just think it's really interesting to see like where it is now. And the most popular and common story that we tend to hear and that we've seen translated to film, like Song of the Sea. I think they mentioned it, but it wasn't exact. One thing I really liked about Song of the Sea was it was a really cool, broader fairy movie. It wasn't just
Right.
about Selkies. I love that kind of stuff too, where
It's
they,
very
because
supernatural and very
Mhm.
cool. Mm-hmm.
I'm obsessed with Selkies specifically, but I love when they're like a part of a bigger world.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I can get a little too like myopically focused on
Mm-hmm.
this one thing. It's also just kind of overwhelming to think if I applied this obsession or passion to other things like trolls or fairies or mermaids or whatever, it would just be more overwhelming than it already is.
Yeah.
So I try to stay a little bit more focused.
Well, can you put on your storytelling hat a little bit and tell us the story of one of the original Selkie stories? Maybe the one from the Song of the Sea, or one of the original ones that you think are most commonly told.
Well, so I think there's two different ways to go with that, because the stories that we're most familiar with, I think definitely this is something I'm looking into right now. Like I said, I'm more kind of at the beginning of my journey. I don't have all the answers yet,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully someday if I get a doctorate and have a chance and resources to really like dig into this on an academic level and a professional level, that I'll have more. I'll be on the other side of things where I can definitively say like, yes, this is the answer to that question. But right now, from what I understand in just my own DIY research, some of the original stories, at least I'm getting most of this from those books I just mentioned, because they focus more on the oral tradition as opposed to a lot of Selkie stories. A lot of the books that I've collected are like children's books,
Mm-hmm.
or they're part of anthologies, or they're part of like fairy Bibles and things where they tell the same story where um, there is and I mean it's the same story. I don't want to be redundant. It's the same story that she told on your first episode, where there's a lonely fisherman or crofter
Mm-hmm.
that one day is out at sea or on the strand, and he sees the most beautiful visage of a woman that he's ever seen. Sunbathing on a rock or on the strand, nearby, and then he sees the glistening skin
Mm-hmm.
of a seal, and I guess because understand it seems that usually they know, oh, it's a Selkie. It's not like at least for the more modern telling, they're not like, what is this?
Mm-hmm.
They know to I'm gonna take that
Mm-hmm.
that coat, that I'm going to take that skin and I'm going to hide it in the rafters in my barn, or in a chest. I've seen stories, where they lock it in a chest or something like that. And then, as we've heard many times, the woman has no choice because, she is a creature of the land and the sea.
Mm-hmm.
Without her skin, she can't transform back into a seal and return to her family, oftentimes, or to the sea, which oftentimes consists of a seal family,
Mm-hmm.
or a Selkie family. And so she bears children with the man. And one thing I find really interesting, especially as I've gotten older, is there is a very there's a lot of darker tones to a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's explores some more shadowy sides of human nature, and one of those, is to uh, like essentially, trap somebody in a situation that they don't want to be in. But the stories often make the protagonist a little bit more sympathetic, wherein they're lonely,
Mm-hmm.
they're not vindictive, they don't mean any harm, they just want love, like we all
Mm-hmm.
do. And so they, but they're still kidnapping somebody
Right.
essentially.
Right.
And we can come back to because you asked about the earlier story, but this is the more common modern tale I've come across is, then they bear children, they have a good life, the mother is happy and loves her children, and cares for everybody, and it's a good housekeeper or what have you. And then, by some happenstance, somebody's up in the rafter, the kids are playing, they knock the coat down,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody finds a key, and because she knows it's in the chest, but she doesn't know where the key is, something like that. They come across a kid. It's usually the kid, not the wife for some reason. I think that's kind of interesting too. There's maybe a little bit of hint of mischievousness
Yeah.
there, mischievous, um,
Mischievousness.
mischievous, yeah, mischievousness. Um, and so then the mother wife goes, finds her coat, puts things in order around the house, says to the oldest, "You're in charge now," and they abscond back to the ocean, where they, you know, um, frolic happily in the surf and reconnect with their family that's been patiently waiting for them. So everything works out, except,
Their
and I
children
think
are
this is something that,
abandoned, right?
yes, well, and like the story that your first guest told was the more, um, like the more optimistic version that I've, especially in children's books, where they don't just abandon them, they are still part of their life. They'll still see them from the shore, and they'll watch over them, and they'll,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen stories where they throw them shells for decorations, or and fish. They for forevermore, their fishing stores are never, lacking, and stuff
Right.
like that. But the more adult, like the more sobering ones are, she just leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody's sad, forever. And so to answer then the other side of that question, like what's the original, from what I can tell, it goes back to, um, early kind of cultural, I don't think the right word for it. And I'm not an anthropologist, though. I wish, there's a lot of what ifs, and I wish I had kind of things when it, goes back to my education. Film was a lot of fun, but there's a lot of things that I just wish I had more of a wealth of knowledge of, like some of your other guests. But from what I understand, when a culture is trying to understand the world around them, especially, early ancient pre-literate cultures, prehistoric cultures, they would create their versions of, these stories to explain why it rains,
Mm-hmm.
and why why there's lightning, and why the crops don't grow, or something like that. In this case, because of the abundance of seals, I guess at a certain point, it seems that there was that sort of explanatory, for to explain like where things came from, or why the whole, the first seal was the morning star that, Satan, or was a fallen
Oh,
angel.
okay, yeah.
Was and then the children, or I'm sorry, the other angels that um followed that character to, to their uh
Underworld.
yeah, exactly, like they
Mhm.
were essentially the seals are fallen angels, or remnants of them, or
Mhm.
ancestors or something, so that there was that kind of stuff back there. But on the more explanatory front, it seems that some cultures, the Irish and Scottish especially, often talk about Selkies uh, in the same breath and scope of people lost at sea.
Mhm.
You hear a lot that, like, what the sea will take, the sea will have, or that the sea must have.
Mhm.
I've heard that quote a few times, and that has to do, I think, with people explaining either, to their children, or mourning widows about why daddy didn't come home
Mhm.
from his fishing voyage. He's a Selkie, went back to his people,
Right.
something like that. Maybe mom died in childbirth. She just went back to her people, and that's another. They call them the people. Um,
So,
and
in the
yep.
viewpoint of the fallen angels, are they considered evil or uh,
And
negative?
it's a lot of these stories. A lot of these stories, especially the ones that I'm referring to currently. And again, this is why I had I never thought I'd be wanting to go, especially after my graduate experience, which wasn't as much fun as my undergraduate. I didn't think I'd want to go back to academia, but a lot of this stuff, these kind of questions, are the ones that I really think that's
Mhm.
the kind of thing that I could really uncover more, because the stories that I'm thinking of, especially in David Thompson's People of the Sea book, where he went around to many different places, a lot of times they were just little snippets. Like, he would be talking to somebody at a dinner table or a pub or something, and they would just mention this kind of thing offhand,
Mhm.
but they wouldn't tell a full-fledged, 3-act story that with a resolution and denouement and everything. They
Mhm.
would just say, "Oh, yeah, they're fallen angels," leave it at that.
Okay.
So but at the same time, in a lot of these stories, especially the ones from Scotland, this is a big theme, and you can hear more about it in my podcast, because I summarized all the stories. The podcast for me right now, because you had asked earlier about, like, what led to that, I got to this point where I had been collecting so much stuff, and I had written a story. My brother was a kind of an off and on illustrator,
Mhm.
and we had talked about maybe making a graphic novel together, and he offered me, the opportunity to write it for him. And I had things gestating for a while, but a couple of, well, about a little bit more than a decade now, I lived on Maui for a couple of years. So in my life, I grew up pretty landlocked. I grew up in Buffalo, Columbus, Ohio, Baltimore, Maryland. Now I'm in Richmond, Virginia. I was pretty landlocked. I didn't have much of a relationship with the ocean or bodies of water really in general. I was much more of a city guy, and I liked the buzz and
Mhm.
the freneticness, the kinetic nature of urban environments. And then I had the opportunity to go live on Maui with a friend, and it just kind of changed my whole perspective, and it changed everything, especially my relationship with the world.
Mhm.
And because I never felt so connected with, like, the natural world before,
Yeah.
and the ocean, of course, is a huge part of that. But I also, I was just really, personally, in a hobby way, like, just really interested in Selkies, and it was always this thing that was there. I dabbled with it in college. I've been collecting work and just making mental notes, but I
Mhm.
didn't have, like, an outlet for it. I didn't have any end goal in mind. And then so when I left Maui, and I was pretty distraught over that for a while, and especially being so far away from the ocean. But
Yeah.
while I was there, I had a couple of chance encounters with Hawaiian monk seals, which, let's see if I can grab this book. So Hawaiian monk seals are they're this is my only book in this Selkie collection that's not Selkie related. It's
Okay.
just seal related, but um, the thing about these guys that I found so fascinating is that they are indigenous to the islands, and they're one of the only species that is, specific to one. Like they're used to. There's a Mediterranean and a Caribbean monk seal. One of them is extinct. Like I think it's the Caribbean that are, but they're still like all over that region.
Mhm.
Whereas the Hawaiian monk seal is only found in Hawaii and nowhere else.
Oh, interesting.
So there was something really kind of special and mysterious about that for me. They're very elusive. You don't see them very much. So the fact that I saw them a couple times while I was living there, and not looking for them, really just, I don't know, it kind of sparked a new
Interest.
branch for this stuff
Mhm.
because I never had an experience with seals personally before. I've seen them in aquariums and things, but I had
Right.
never, you know, come across one after coming in after a day of surfing, thinking it was a big rock on the beach, and there's a Hawaiian
A
monk
live
seal.
animal.
Yeah, and it was glorious. It was beautiful and it was majestic, and it was so silly. It was just like laying on its back, like basking in the sun. It was so cute. And so that eventually, especially when I left Maui and just dealing with all the feelings about that and everything, that was the spark for this story that I started to tell with my brother. We were going to make a graphic novel. The problem was that it became so massive
Mm-hmm.
and big in scale that we both of us just kind of realized that we weren't going to be able to actually like create anything substantial in any reasonable amount of time. And I was starting a family, and he was changing careers, so we decided to put it on hold. But the story, the characters, and the meaning behind all of it for me has always been there. And that's when I realized too that the the fascination that I've had with not just Selkies specifically, but the different versions
Mm-hmm.
and the culture, like the view, the lens into the culture that creates for me, where I had never really just had any reason to be specifically interested in like Icelandic culture,
Mm-hmm.
but as soon as I hear just because it's not in the forefront of my attention. But then I hear that they have their own, specific brand of Selkies. Then that's just like a window, a vessel into, learning more and wanting. It's a motivating factor. And so the Hawaiian thing, because I found out, that they have this, um, what's the word? The I can't remember if it's critically or severely. There's a specific
Oh,
scientific word, but they're almost extinct. There's less than 5,000 or a
you're
thousand. I'd have
endangered.
to look at my stats at
Mm-hmm.
this point. Yeah, they're just there's a lot of different living factors, but with all that and just understanding that they were like this, um, very unique and isolated thing. Um, that gave me a little bit more of like purpose behind
Mm-hmm.
the stories that I wanted to tell, but then also connecting that with the fact that like when I originally tried to tell a Selkie story back in college for when I was doing my film stuff was more of just emulating or adapting what had already been there
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't really have a story to tell as much as I was just interested in the lore and the characters.
Mm-hmm.
But this was the first like really personal, substantial, emotionally resounding thing that kind of all came together for me.
There
So
weren't
that's really what the oh sorry.
there weren't any lore related to the seals in Hawaii that you heard of?
Not I'm still looking into that. So I
Mm-hmm.
I am still so like in the avalanche of the Celtic side of things
Mm-hmm.
that I've only been able to scratch the surface. And I really wish that I had while I was there that I had thought to mine the knowledge
Mm.
of you know of the people that I was more like the people that were more available
Mm-hmm.
to me, immediately, people, the elders and teachers, professors, a lot of connections that I could have had or made. I didn't think to at the time. But I learned about the Menehune, which are their sort of version. Well, it depends on who you ask, of course, but they're sort of like the little people in Hawaii. They're the supernatural people
Okay.
you don't see, but they're always there behind the scenes. But they could also there's different interpretations of that, and different, even Hawaii like has its own branches of culture,
Right.
things even being a small place. But um, yeah, so it was like, oh wow, I've been really interested in this Celtic folklore that comes more from my ancestry and everything, but I've had such a profound connection with a place and a culture that really, I had no background or even necessarily like right to appropriate, and that's not what I was trying to do, but I just felt organically like so, for the first time, as an adult, like this is kind of where I belong,
Hmm.
and this is the kind of culture that really speaks to me, and I feel so at home with it, that it felt like the right way to kind of tell my own story
Hmm.
using this stuff as a
Jumping
an
off
entry
point.
point.
Hmm.
Yeah, to but to take it, I use the word evolution a lot, but that's really how I
Hmm.
see a lot of this. I see folklore and storytelling is it's all of the things that have come before, and then it's you and the way that you interpret it, and then it branches in another direction from there. Um,
Right. Folktales
and
change per storyteller, and then it continues to
mhm.
change through the oral traditions. Yeah.
And like you've heard all these different tales of, there's like a traveling storyteller, or just somebody traveling through. They hear a story in one place, they go back to where they're originally from, which is a completely different, and they bring that story, and then it takes on a life of its
Right.
own. And I just think that kind of stuff is absolutely fascinating, but also critical to you know the the essence of like why we tell stories,
Hmm.
and what folklore really is, and but also like, to not to be more, to find connections between things that are seemingly, either like disparate or at odds, like different cultures.
Hmm.
There's always things, because we were, and you talked about this on other episodes of your podcast too, where um dragons and mermaids and all that kind of stuff, those ideas are found all over the world, and were they inspired, influenced by each other or not? Or was it just because humans have similar ways of perceiving things, and,
Hmm.
you know, um, and extrapolating it? And I think it's all of that stuff is true. And I think that just kind of shows like how, no matter like who we are, where we are, and what time period it is, we there's more that connects us than divides us, and I think this is just one great example of that.
Hmm.
And then we have more to learn from each other than we do to take from each other,
Right.
or however you want to look at it.
So, can you give us some different varieties of the Selkie stories that you heard from your
Sure.
researches? Your research, not
So
researches.
I think you can pluralize research, right?
Yes, we'll
Because
do
I'm
that.
doing because I'm doing research with the Celtic side of things,
Uh-huh.
and eventually I'm going to get to doing a lot more hardcore researches with the Hawaiian side of things, and,
Uh-huh.
and Polynesian, and that's really, so I feel like that's kind of, in Hawaii they say kuleana.
Hmm.
It's responsibility, like it's your kuleana to, you've been dealt this card. Now what are you going to do with it? I feel like because I've had the experiences that I've had, and the interests and passions that I've had, is not just being interested in Selkies, or living in Maui, or being a filmmaker, but all those things together, or a storyteller. I
Hmm.
wouldn't really call myself a filmmaker, honestly. I was more interested in film as a medium for stories,
Hmm.
not as a technical. I love film. I
Hmm.
love the technical side of it, but that's not really where my interests really are. It's
Hmm.
more in the blueprint, of what makes a good movie, which isn't, to me, it's not how it looks. It's what it's about,
Hmm.
who it's about, and how the story is told. So, it's all my kuleana kind of feels now. that I've had these experiences, and I've had these skills, and I've been exploring these things, is to find a way to kind of bridge all these things, and kind of make my own branch off of that, that hopefully will just become part of the Mobius of folklore and Selkie lore and storytelling, so it doesn't stagnate. Because to answer your question, so some of the examples of the variants of stories that I've heard, one thing I would really like to bring, if anything that I do ever make kind of catches on, makes any kind of traction, is exposing people not just to this specific kind of lore, because I'm like it tends to get overshadowed by mermaids and sirens and sea beasts and stuff like that. Even though it does seem to become a little bit more, I don't know about mainstream, but there's a lot of books that are coming out. My wife just found a couple recently, like this one. I didn't even know, because I've been doing a lot of different researching over the years.
Okay.
Part of it is just Googling or looking on Amazon, and some of this stuff is pretty new. And there's some kid books I found, some children's books that all share the same name, like the Selkie or the Selkie Girl. And 5-10 years ago, when I looked up the Selkie Girl, there was like 1 or 2 books. Now there's like 5. So it's definitely catching on.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's also like a whole branch of romance novels that I have barely
I think
got
that
to,
they
but
might
that's
be
a huge thing.
incorporated in the Outlander. I think they might have been mentioned in Outlander. Do you know? I
Really?
think so, because it's in Scotland. And I read the book several years ago, and I feel like I remember it being mentioned, but maybe one of the listeners can verify this.
Oh, I would love to know, because like I'm in this journey right now to collect every mention, everything I can find, just to have a marker for it, to say like, okay, it's here, here, and here. But it's funny that you mentioned that, though, because I recently watched The Northman by the filmmaker's name. Shoot, the guy that did The Witch and The Lighthouse, and then he did that with Skarsgård. Oh gosh, Alexander Skarsgård, right? No, one of them, one of the Skarsgårds, the big beefy one.
Okay.
It was the a Norse revenge tale, essentially, but it's very, very strange, very offbeat, because he's a very avant-garde kind of director. But there was a line in there, they mentioned the foxes. They were talking about the animals on this particular island they were on, which was in Iceland, and they mentioned like, oh, they must be out there with the foxes and the wolves and the Selkies. Excuse me. It was like blink and you miss it, but I thought it was really interesting because, sorry, excuse me. The a lot of times in the books, the oral tradition books, especially, that I was going back through, for my podcast, sometimes it was hard to tell if somebody said the word Selkie, if they just meant seal. Sometimes, or did they equate a seal with a shape-shifting supernatural being? It seems like it's kind of, especially for some of the older generations, that the book that I'm referring to right now was published in 1954. So it's the generations that he was talking to, were, some of them could have been from, the 1900s. And they would just say, they would talk about the Selchies or the Selkies, that like ate fish in their net. And it was unclear usually if they really meant a seal, or like, so I wonder too, like in Outlander, if they were just referring to seals, but that was the vernacular as part of their culture.
There were some supernatural elements too. I mean, it
Were
was
they?
time traveling. So,
Right.
So there was.
So yeah. And I think that's really cool. It's really mysterious, when you don't really even know what the intentions are. And I love that ambiguity too. And a lot of times folklore is a great balance of, it tells you things as if it's real and it happened. And it's up to you to decide there's not a lot of over explaining or you
Mm-hmm.
know necessarily like too much exposition for exposition's sake. The audience, a lot of times for these tales, you kind of expect that they understand certain aspects of it that don't need to be beaten over the head with it, and
Right.
I appreciate that. But anyway, so we were talking about the different variants of the
Variations.
story. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one good example too. Is if you're telling a story, but about Selkies, but you're just talking about seals, which
Right.
did come up in some of the research that I did. But also, so the most common one is the one that we went over about the somebody stealing the skin and eventually being discovered and then going back to the sea. But in the uh, Tales of the Seal People by Duncan Williamson, specifically about Scottish. Sorry, sometimes my brain just moves faster than my mouth can. I'm especially being on camera. I am a content creator and I make podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff. But one reason that I was a writer in school and not an actor was because I'm not very comfortable just
In front of
by
the
nature
camera,
in front of the camera. Yeah.
behind the camera.
So it's a good challenge for me. But the a big theme, a through line through a lot of the stories, and you had also asked about if they're fallen angels, are they evil?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it was never explained explicitly in the stories that I've read so far, but I think there's a lot of things you can infer
Mm-hmm.
because especially like in the Scottish versions, a lot of times there are, and these are like very very dissimilar and not at all like just somebody stealing a skin and either tricking or trying to espouse somebody. um, but otherwise they are just like a mysterious people that um, are known by locals maybe, or there's chatter about them but nobody's ever seen them.
Mm-hmm.
They're elusive, like seals
Mm-hmm.
can be. But then there'll be somebody that comes on, uh, has an encounter that proves these people to be real. So for instance, one of the stories that comes to mind is a guy that is a cattle farmer, um, on some Scottish island, probably like the Orkneys or the Shetlands or something like that, gets commissioned by this mysterious man. It's always a mysterious, tall, dark person in a long black or brown cloak with
Mm-hmm.
like deep black or brown eyes, pale skin. They almost sound, like vampiristic or something, the way that they
Mm-hmm.
describe them. They dissimilar to, and like your guest mentioned in that first episode, a lot of times, most of the time, from what we hear, they're referred to as the most beautiful, like inhumanly beautiful
Yeah.
and alluring and seductive, kind of people. But that's not always true. And if you go back in the oral traditions, a lot of times they're almost like sallow and scary, and creepy and
Interesting.
off-putting. Um,
Even the
yeah, and
females.
in this particular story, I'm sorry.
Even the females.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and I mean, and there's so many different variations, but well, like in one story that the author had heard of the people of the, so the two titles are so similar, I often get them confused. But the tales of the, no, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. The people of the sea, the one that was more of a chronicle of different cultures, had a story of the reason the author wrote it was because he grew up um, in Scotland and some of the other places that he heard a lot of the stuff as a kid, and he had some encounters himself. So he wanted to go back and do some adult, collecting of these things before they were out of,
Mm-hmm.
out of favor and out of the oral tradition. But he tells a story about a woman in town that allegedly walked around on flippers, or it looked like she did because her
Wow.
feet were turned out to the side.
Mm-hmm.
But she was big and rotund and very friendly, and she didn't have arms. And she had, they always have black or brown eyes, though. The eyes are very telling. But and it looked like they're always wearing some kind of long, silky dress or cloak or coat
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. They usually don't refer to it as a skin though, which is interesting. Because in the stories that we hear more commonly, the skin is discarded.
Right.
They have to step out of their skin and put it to the side. But in these other versions of the stories that I've been looking into, they keep it on them the whole time,
Mm-hmm.
and they're very protective of it. So anyway, this one, and there's another one too that's an interesting variant on this, but it's a different tone. This one, the guy that the mysterious man that commissions the cattle farmer, he needs him to take a cow out to this island that is known to be uninhabited and barren. There's nothing there, so he's suspicious. Why are you asking me to take a cow out to this place? Very arduously too, because the cow has to swim behind the boat while he's harnessed onto it. It sounds pretty awful, actually. A lot of these practices, but it's different time. The um, the cow is taken out there. The man in the boat says, "Okay, is when we get near the island, you have to close your eyes, and you're not allowed to look." Uh, that's his condition
Mm-hmm.
to paying him for this service. And of course, the man does look because he's too curious.
Mm-hmm.
And what he sees is a whole bunch of other mysterious, cloaked, tall, kind of sinister, at least to him, looking folks that he'd never seen before that are all over this island that's supposed to be uninhabited. And they slaughter this cow and they eat it. And, he pretends that he wasn't looking, but of course, the guy knows that he was looking. So when he um, gets back on shore, the man like blows some kind of powder in his face and blinds him for his sin or his
Uh-huh.
his
Very Greek
deception.
mythology.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, and so like that's that kind of stuff too, where like listening to some of your other podcasts and hearing some versions of other stories, I'm like, wow, that sounds a lot like
Yes.
this one, but it's with different setting, different characters, different supernatural beings, but
Mm-hmm.
similar messages, and things that come out of it. But then another version in that same book are a uh, let's see, there's so many that they get a little muddled in my head. Again, I have it a lot more chronicled neatly on
Mm-hmm.
my podcast, but a man essentially, let's see, he disappears. No, that was a sibling. Okay, there was a sibling one where these twins, the brother disappears, but the sister eventually finds him, but he's gone to live with the people, and he had to cut off his toe as a sign of good faith or commitment or something. So she doesn't want to become a SEAL, so they just spend the rest of their years, cavorting like in a cave or something, so she can see him.
Uh-huh.
But the parents think that he's dead, and they won't believe anything otherwise, of course. And then when the sister eventually dies in old age, and this is one of those, like folk legends where it's told because there's supposed evidence for it, where there's like a toeless footprint towards her grave
Oh,
in this town. Yeah. But the other one I was thinking of was really interesting because you're asking about, like that are different than the other kind. There are stories about love and people finding their mate and things like that. So there was one oh that's right. Okay, so there was a young man who was disliked in his town, his village. He just had a sour personality or something, and but he was an egg farmer, I believe, and there was another girl in town who was the most sought after bonny young lass that ever could be, that everybody was wanted to be a suitor. But he brought her eggs, and it just so happened that um, her seal people. A lot of times in this Scottish version, especially, they didn't refer to them as Selkies. Sometimes they call them Silkies,
mm-hmm.
Silkies. And there's a whole other thing we could talk about there with the vernacular, but um, she was with her seal people friends in the house, and he kind of was walked into something he wasn't supposed to. So she gives him an ultimatum. you can kind of join us, or I don't know, something bad will happen, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so he decides that he's going to, keep quiet, and they give him his own cloak. So in
And
this
this is on
story,
land? Is this happening on
yeah,
land?
so yeah, and so that's another interesting thing too, because most of the time, from what we hear about Selkies, they are always yearning for the sea, and that was one of the big things that caught my attention right away about my friend Chris's story back in
Mm-hmm.
the day, was that this, because his was a very, very symbolic of, uh, like the detachment from, as you grow up to wanting to be your own person and get away from, your parents' reign
Mm-hmm.
and everything, and stuff like that. So, but I found that with this mom that was trying to like kind of control and connive this situation where her son could never, she doled out how much water he could have at any given time, and he was only allowed to take baths or anything, so he didn't indulge too much and become a seal or whatever it was. And um, but his like strong yearning, to like be anywhere that than where he was, and to be doing anything else, and to be free of this tyranny, of this oppression, was something that was just very relatable, especially as a teen.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yep.
um and yeah, so I that kind of stuff, I think that thematic stuff is more of the through line, honestly, than the surface facade of like, are they an actual seal shapeshifter? Do they take off their skin? Do they just wear a cloak? And it's that kind of stuff. I think is a little bit less like important to like what it really all means.
To the heart of it.
Yeah, because like in this tale, the this couple, now that he was accepted, like, so it also changes his, once he gets his own cloak of his own and becomes one of the people, it changes his whole, personality and way of interacting with the world. Now he's liked by people, but he's also now, kind of isolated and
Mm-hmm.
exclusionary with these people. But this was another one of those like folk legends, where people would say like, oh, this happened in this village. These were actual people that,
Oh,
they were, and
uh-huh.
these stories were passed down more locally. But they were, yeah, so they were on land. Every time that they would be seen was on land, but they always wore their cloaks. They even wore them when they got married, and they made arrangements to have them on them when they were buried together. Um, but they would also leave for long stretches of a time, and nobody knew where they were. So you can infer that they were
In the ocean.
frolicking in the waves together and
Well, that
catching
leads me
fish
to
and
another
everything.
question that my son wanted me to ask. He's 6. He just turned 7. And
Oh,
when I read him the Selkie story from the Hidden Folk, he really kept asking, "How do Selkies get their skin?"
yes, and we had mentioned the romance side of this stuff. There's a couple books by Melanie Jackson. I think these are some of the most popular when it comes to adult fiction, and they're really not as smutty as a lot of romance novels,
Mhm.
but they really are much more about the lore and
Mhm.
the fairy. There's a lot of fae stuff going on in her books, but one is called the Selkie, and one is called the Selkie Bride. And in the Selkie, her first Fae novel, the it's actually, and so this is another iteration too that is, I heard a lot, that I heard before, uh, like early on when I was getting into this stuff, the idea, the more ceremonial part of it, where if a woman was, um, she was in want or need of a mate. She wanted children, she wanted a family, but she didn't have anybody available. She would go cry 7 tears into the sea, and sometimes it had to be on a certain, moon
Mhm.
phase
Yeah.
or ocean tide or something. Sometimes that was tied in with it, sometimes not. But it's looked like Melanie Jackson looks like she's read a lot of the same books, because I've heard this story a lot. Also, I'd say this is like maybe the second most common one, after the stealing the skin thing.
Mhm.
is, a woman would cry into the sea, and then a male suitor would be obligated to come and mate with her so that they could bear children. But um, there's different versions of like, does she just get to keep the kids, or he comes back for them and takes them back into the sea? Depends on the tone. A lot of times the stories are going for what the moral is. But in Melanie Jackson's book, because it's a romance novel, so it all has to work out perfectly. Um, they there's some struggle with an evil Fin Man, and and some sorcery and stuff going on. But at the end, not to spoilers, I guess, but she gets gifted a seal skin of somebody that had, I don't, died either naturally or
Oh,
was killed, maybe by a fisherman or a boat propeller. Her books are set during World War One,
okay.
or just after World War One, so they're a little bit more modernized. And yeah, so that I've seen that crop up too, where it's like, oh, and you see that a lot in more modernized fairy tale. Well, it's the Little Mermaid story, right? It's like, I don't want to be where I am. I want to be part of that world.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you do that in the Selkie world. Is somebody gives you a skin of a Selkie that doesn't need it anymore because they're probably dead,
Uh-huh.
and they get to
And then you
they get to become
a seal.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
what do you feel like is the heart of these stories? Or I'm sure it's different per region and per story, but do you feel like there's a common thread or a heartbeat, if you will?
I do, and that was one thing that I wanted. One reason I wanted to do the podcast was to revisit a lot of this stuff, but also have an excuse to buy more books
Yeah.
and and catalog it. And that's my goal right now for the podcast, is to go through the material that I have and anything else that comes along, like the hidden folk, which I wasn't aware of until yesterday when I listened to your podcast. So let's see. The I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The question was,
like a common thread or the heartbeat of these stories.
Right. So it really depends, on the culture. A lot of times, if it's more like, I have a lot of these just like Bibles and anthologies, like this one was one of the ones I got in Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
the Irish Fairies Pocket Guide. It's very matter of fact. It's like, this is what a Selkie is,
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really tell you a lot about it. There's not like a lot of story there, but there's still some things you can imply, because it will also describe, it describes other kinds of creatures, that are more like tricky, or like sirens or changelings,
Mm-hmm.
that have nefarious plans. Selkies never, even in the anthology, or just like the collected uh, books about what's the word I'm looking for? More like uh, encyclopedia books, where they're just giving more information.
Okay.
The Selkies tend to be given an air of um, benignness. Most of the time, they're still pretty reclusive, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
mean any harm. They just want to do their thing and be left alone. So that, when compared to some other things like Murrows are a similar, kind of mermaid, mer person, Selkie siren offshoot, but they are usually evil
Oh,
or
okay.
predatory. Yeah. Carnivorous or what have you. But when it comes to the more like folklore tales that I've read and gone through, there's, like I touched on before, a lot thematically. A lot of times it's dealing with loss and grief, and I think a lot of the stories were told to help process or alleviate some
Mm-hmm.
of that stuff, especially when it comes to that harsher lifestyle of like
Yes.
living, yeah, in agriculturally or pre-agriculturally on a coastal kind of lifestyle was very, challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and thematically too, I think there's a lot about loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
and, lost love or yearning for love, or, partnership, mating, um, a lot of stuff like that. It tends to be very somber, which is ironic for me because I'm like to think I'm a pretty upbeat person. I tend to not like to wallow in depressing stuff, but there is something also like very universal about it.
Mm-hmm.
Something very compelling to me. I think in the end there is still, and I would say on to like wrap up the thematic part is there's still a lot of hope, because it's not even when somebody's abandoned, they usually it's because they didn't do the right thing. They trapped somebody ashore that they shouldn't have. It wasn't the right thing to do,
Right.
and usually their comeuppance for that is what well where they started with, just lonely, brokenhearted.
Mm-hmm.
But their mate, spouse, lover, whatever is still out there, still. And like I said, if, maybe it's a lost parent or sibling or something, instead of just them being gone and deceased, they're still that chance, that hope that they're out there somewhere.
Right.
They're just in a different form now. Um, so those kind of themes too have really helped inform the kind of story that I am looking to tell. I'm waiting for the right time and the right medium, but also I feel like I've written drafts of this thing, which
A
again
graphic
started
novel.
more as a graphic novel,
Mm-hmm.
but and which I would probably the most visual way to tell it. I don't think a film would ever actually come to fruition. I am open to writing a novel, but I don't know if that's really the way that I would prefer to tell it, just because of my film background and my more visual science. But one thing that your guest too said in that first episode I thought was really helpful for me when it came to storytelling in general is, what did she say? She said that there is something lost with the value and the universal relatability of a folk tale or folklore
Mm-hmm.
when we tend to adapt it for film, television, graphic novels, something more visual, because you're putting a face on
Mm-hmm.
characters that may or may not, be culturally specific, but that doesn't matter if you're telling it to somebody of a different culture. They can put their own visage on and
Mm-hmm.
relate to that person. I never thought about it like that, honestly. I was really kind of taken aback in a good way, like, wow, I love film, but when you visualize this kind of stuff, it does make it a little bit more specific. And there's a whole podcast thread we could go off on that, but I think that's really interesting,
Mm-hmm.
because humans have only been documenting stuff visually for the past 150 years or
Mm-hmm.
so.
Right.
Before, well, I'm sorry, in terms of modern technology, of course they've been
Right. On
doing
film.
it, yeah. But even so, in terms of I think, going back to like early, anthropologically speaking, or the oral tradition, sitting around a campfire in a hall or in even a pub or something, telling stories, and even more than reading them, you're getting so much from the storyteller,
Mm-hmm.
but also just the tone and the words coming at you, and you processing them. You have total control over how you interpret all of that, as opposed to it being more spoon fed for you,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't a bad thing. I just think it's interesting,
Mm-hmm.
um, and helpful for me to look at like how I want to tell my own story. But anyway, but we were also, I think there's another side of things. There's the thematic stuff, and then when it comes to fairy tales, often there's morality tales. And so in a lot of the stories were tales about, like the one that I mentioned about the cattle, and just in general, there was a lot about, again, like I keep referring back to that first episode because it's so fresh in my mind. But she was talking a lot about trolls, but everything she was talking about could apply to any of this storytelling, because
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of there is a lot of morality in Selkie stories, Selkie tales about being kind, being honest, uh, having integrity and accountability.
Yeah.
Not expecting other people to take on your kuleana, like I said before.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of stories about if you try to take the shortcut, or if you try to trick somebody, or manipulate or connive to get something, it's going to go poorly, or you're going to have to make up for that in another way. You see those kind of morality messages coming through really strongly too, and that's another reason too that I don't find this stuff nihilistic or depressing, even though there is a lot of darkness, darker themes, and there's a lot of somberness to the content. Is that
Mm-hmm.
it does tend to give you something productive or constructive to take away from it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all just life sucks and then you die.
Yeah.
There's you could have made better choices. And maybe if you can learn from the bad choices that these people made.
Exactly.
And then again, on the flip side, there are so many stories, especially I think when it comes to telling them to children. There's this wonderful book. Let's see if I can grab it here. This one. This is called Selkie. This is I wouldn't even call it like a graphic or a novel or anything. It's just art. There's no words. There's no text, but it's a beautiful visual telling about just like a chance encounter of somebody falling off of a boat and being saved by a seal. But there's so much like expressive, emotive moments in it, and it flows
Uh-huh.
really interestingly. But there's kind of there's a bittersweet. A lot of these stories are very bittersweet,
Mm-hmm.
where you know you wish that they could reconcile or spend the rest of their time together, but because they're of two different worlds, but at least they had that moment, they had
Yeah.
that connection. There's this other book. Let's see if it's this one. No. There's, like I said, there's a lot of Selkie girls books called The Selkie Girl or Selkie Girl, but is the one? Oh yeah, this one is wonderful too. And for anybody that is looking to like grow their fade collection, this one has a oh, was this the one? Sorry. Yes. Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. This is the one. It came with a paper doll cutouts and stuff. So
Oh,
like
fun.
I have a little Selkie doll,
Yeah.
and you can put like dresses on the seal girl and stuff. But it's a wonderful little book. But it's about a boy who's kind of like lonely and isolated in his little fishing village, and it's a fun little spin on the adult version that's more sad and and somber, because he does take her skin, but he just wants to play with her. He's a kid, and he just wants a playmate. And she's lonely too, because she spends all of her time mostly by herself or with her mother. So she gets the chance to come ashore and learn about the human ways. He learns about the seal ways, and they share like a week together. And then he graciously gives her back her thing, and her seal skin, and but they still interact after that. So there's a lot of positivity
Mm-hmm.
and fun and folly
Yeah.
in these stories too. A lot of variance is really what it is. There's no one Selkie tale, and that's one thing that I find. Like I said, I don't want to like criticize anybody. It is what it is, but there is a lot more to this than I think is often commonly known or
Right.
expressed. And that's true with, I think, most things. Is you things will bubble to the surface in mainstream pop culture, or whatever it is, or Disney makes an adaptation of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a great entry point and gateway. But I always urge people to look deeper if they're interested in any of these things, because there's always so much more to glean from it, and
Mm-hmm.
so much more to enjoy from it than just what's been kind of packaged and sold.
Exactly. Well, thanks so much. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. But I really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything else you want to mention before we
Um, no,
maybe?
I just really appreciate. I'm really curious. Are you ever going to do? I haven't gotten through all of your episodes yet, but I would love to know like your story and what brought you here, because it sounds like we're on a similar kind of path of just loving this
Yeah.
part of human culture and trying to understand it better,
Uh-huh.
and so
I'm pretty much, I'm very similar to you in that I'm at the beginning of my journey. I kind of started this journey because I'm a writer and I enjoy writing little stories for my kids. And I decided that I wanted to write a folklore series that was
cool.
uh, for little children. And it's exploring different cultures and different folklores in each place that they visit. So it's kind of a traveling um, series for kids. Anyways, and so I
That's awesome.
wanted to start doing research into folklore, and I thought it would be a more awesome experience to start a podcast to really connect with the people who really understand
Yeah.
folklore the best. And so that's how I kind of got into this journey. So it's a little similar
Well, I
to
totally,
yours.
yeah, I can totally relate, and I agree. I think sometimes it's hard to see in such an oversaturated, market and place of content, on the internet. It's like everybody has a podcast, but
Yeah.
also, as a teacher, I try to remind students to when they say like, I don't, I don't know how to be creative with this tool that you gave me. I'm a technology teacher,
Hmm.
and I just like, well, what's your story? What's
Hmm.
your perspective? We just had an author visit our school recently. Jason Reynolds is a young adult poet and author. He did like a Miles Morales book for Marvel, but he's done a lot of personal stuff. But that was his whole kind of thesis and takeaway. He did this great talk about his background and what got him to be internationally recognized, national best-selling author. Was like, I just told my story, you know,
Yeah.
and it's mine. It may be sound similar to other people's, it may not be relatable to certain people, but it's
Hmm.
it's my story, and everybody has one. And like
Yeah.
the most important thing that you could, ever offer is your story to other people. And I think that that's a wonderful like takeaway just from storytelling in general. Can
Yeah.
seem frivolous sometimes with how many other things are going on in life and how much noise there is on the internet, but yeah, like you said, connecting with people with similar interests and hobbies, but also just telling our own stories.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's how we do that.
And yeah, stories are how we connect to one another and how we connect to humanity. And I think it's storytelling is so important.
Agreed.
Well, awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, Dan. And thank
Thanks
you,
for having me.
Volcanites, for joining us on this Breathing Underwater Selkie episode today. All links that we talked about today will be on our website, www.fabricoffolklore.com. And we definitely appreciate you being here and listening. And make sure that you're subscribing to either our YouTube channel, or if you're listening on a podcasting streaming platform, subscribe there, like, comment. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think. If you have questions for Dan or for me, let us know. We want to hear from you. We also have a Facebook page, a Facebook community page where you can ask those questions as well, and we can start conversations there. So that's there for y'all, so we can really gauge where you're wanting this podcast to go, because we want to make this podcast as interesting as possible for the listeners. And the best thing that you can do besides commenting and communicating via the different socials is sharing this with your friends. So if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure that you text the people that you share your Wordle score with every single day and tell them about your awesome new podcast that you're listening to. And so thank you for joining us, unraveling the mysteries of folklore. And until next time, keep the folk alive.